Welcome back to the show as we continue our discussion on the growing relationship between China and Africa. Let me start this part of the show with Ayabonga in Johannesburg. Ayabonga, we heard from you the different sectors that will benefit from this relationship with China. Let's look at one thing that Africa is actually having a problem with right now, and that is job creation. How does this relationship with China create jobs?
Look, I think Mr. Gao is correct initially in saying that this kind of relationship has the potential to introduce a different kind of development paradigm into the continent. And it's a development paradigm that's going to go against the prevailing logic, which is one of sort of using the continent for accumulation through extraction, but also with very little value addition. So I think, for instance, if we look at the mineral sector in the continent, there's significant possibilities through this partnership and relationship with Africa to really have a lot of beneficiation of our minerals and all of our resources happening domestically, and the significant forward and backward linkages there that can create the possibilities of jobs. I've already spoken about the digital jobs. I think also if you look at the sphere of agriculture, where according to a McKinsey Global Institute study last year, Africa has 60% of the world's available uncultivated arable land. Now, for me, that presents significant opportunities if we are able to transition away from a subsistence model towards a commercially viable model through the use of technology and skills transfer that I think a lot of the Chinese investors that are coming into the continent sort of present the possibilities of. Then we'll be able to unlock a lot of the jobs, not only on the countryside, but also in the urban context through the support that's provided through the industrialization. So I think there's a lot of possibilities that we have across the board and across a range of sectors. And I think one of the things that African countries need to do themselves is to begin to say, how does this investment and this cooperation and partnership with China align to the existing development priorities of the continent? For instance, if we look at the infrastructure, the AU Agenda 2063 has the Promotion of Infrastructure Development in Africa program, the pt3 program. And I think there's a need for us to really have a serious discussion around how do you align a lot of the infrastructure investment, particularly around connectivity in the area of railways. I mean, we know here in South Africa the amount of cooperation that our state rail utility Transnet has had with some of its Chinese counterparts. And I think those kind of relationships and partnerships augur well going forward for some of the job creation imperatives that we have. But I think a lot of it is going to require us as African countries to really think really deeply around how we begin to align this to some of our national level and continental level priorities.
Ambassador, I want to move on to two other things now, and that is political cooperation between Africa and China, as well as security cooperation. I mean, the president of China, President Xi Jinping, he recognized that. He said at the conference that China was ready to play a constructive role in promoting political settlements in Africa's hotspots. He didn't elaborate. Is there potential here for greater cooperation?
I think that there is definitely a need for greater cooperation, and I think that the absence of human rights-related conditionalities, I think, allows for Africa and China to find a trajectory to deal with problems in a less pressurized way, but also for the long term. What do I mean? I think on the one hand, Africa's growth rates are not only threatened by a decline in commodity demand and so forth, it is also threatened by the return of conflicts, but this time mostly in the incarnation of manifestations of extremism. And so what you need is a long view to undercut the roots of extremism, because things are going to get tough and Africa may become susceptible to the siren songs of extremism. And so how do we undercut both the roots as well as the manifestations when they actually become things like Boko Haram and inflame an entire region of Africa, and Shabab spreading out over the east and beginning to find their way to the south? I think that that means that unlike the kind of debates that we hear today in other parts of the world of short-term militaristic interventions, I think the idea of getting, as the Chinese money begins to allow us to do, getting about 200,000 young Africans into vocational training is part of the long-term basis. Secondly, enhancing Africa's capacity to patrol the military incursions of extremists is absolutely crucial. Thirdly, backing up a process of peacemaking in Africa between contending forces, I think is part of it, and strengthening the African Union as an institution to manage these things are all absolutely critical, while at the same time addressing some of the economic abilities of the continent.
Right, Victor, what do you think? It's a long haul, security in Africa, and China has a role to play there because, as the ambassador says, the way to that is through economic development and growth.
Definitely. On the other hand, based on our Chinese experience, in order to achieve economic development and growth and transformation of the society, you need to keep peace at home and keep stability. If you lose peace or stability, if you constantly resort to war or conflicts, or if you are engulfed in instability and chaos, launched by either terrorism, extremism, or separatism, for example, then you lose sanity, and the country can be stuck in nowhere for years, if not for decades. And there will be no development or growth prospect to talk about. Therefore, I think for African countries to really achieve economic prosperity in the long term, enabling the people to move up in terms of living standards, etc. It's not purely economic development, it's development on the condition of maintaining peace and stability. And again, I think if we look around the world, in some parts of North Africa, for example, or Eastern Africa, in the Horn of Africa, in Middle East, in many parts of the Middle East, and the menace is spreading. And I think for many African countries, one of the top priorities is to maintain peace, maintain stability, keep war away from our doorsteps, and then enable the people to really focus on what matters the most. That is economic recovery, economic transformation, growth and development. Deng Xiaoping said, development is the hard truth. It was true to China in the end of the 1970s. It is still true today in China, and I truly believe it is true throughout Africa. Development or green development will remain the hard truth, the soft truth, and the smart truth for decades to come, here for China and over there in the African continent.
Ayabonga, if we look very broadly at the nature of the relationship between China and Africa, if we look at how we characterize this relationship, we heard President Xi Jinping say in South Africa that one of the reasons for these stronger ties between China and Africa is that both sides have always treated each other on an equal footing. Implicit in that, of course, was that Africa's relationship with the West, and many of those countries, of course, are former colonial powers, is very, very different. So is there a distinct difference in China's approach to the way it deals with Africa?
I think one of the things that are being emphasized, especially here in South Africa, is we're always reminded that China is a developing country. And I think there's also a rich political history between a lot of the African countries and their Chinese counterparts. But I think also if you sort of collapse that onto some of the colonial relations that have happened with some of the dominant players in the West, then I think what the Chinese relationship politically with the African continent as a whole presents is not only necessarily a new development paradigm in terms of how we approach our own development priorities, but I think it also presents greater bargaining space for the African continent. You'll be well aware of some of the sort of contentious relationships that a lot of African countries have had with some of the Bretton Woods institutions and some of the more established sort of economies in the North. And I think one of the things that a lot of African leaders are expecting is that this relationship is going to give them greater bargaining space. But I think in addition to that, it's also going to be a relationship where some of the conditionalities aren't, as, how do I put, as sort of polity and economy threatening as some of the historical structural adjustment and shock treatment that we've seen from the likes of the IMF and the World Bank. So I do think that the sentiment is that this kind of partnership and relationship sort of brings together a new paradigm and a new logic of cooperation, but also it needs to be a focal point in strengthening South-to-South cooperation and creating, a different kind of sort of development node and thinking in the global South. And I think, that in and of itself is exciting, but I think also what it does is that it strengthens the bargaining position of many African countries in relation to some of the more traditional partners in the global North. And that can only sort of deal wonders, especially if you look at some of the news that's coming out of the ratings agencies from the North.
Right, and that's true, Ambassador, isn't it? It gives African countries a lot of muscle now in the world, isn't it?
I think that that's the muscle that African countries require, but African countries must watch out for not placing all their eggs in two baskets. The one is use the Chinese opportunity to deepen a manufacturing capacity, a beneficiation capacity, and bargain with China to assist in that so that we don't remain a commodity exporting continent. And on the other hand, let's use this muscle that we now have to diversify so that we don't have a situation where all our commodities are only going to the east. I think we should be finding ways to just spread those kind of export eggs a little bit so that we are also immunized against shock.
Right. Victor, very quickly, I've got half a minute here. We look at this forum established in 2000. The volume of trade between China and Africa was 10 billion. Now it's 300 billion. Is China the best partner for Africa to drive this development?
Definitely, China wants to be the best partner for the African countries, but it doesn't matter. I think if other major countries want to engage fully with African countries, China will welcome that. The taste of the pudding is in eating it. I think it's up to the African brothers and sisters to decide which money coming from which country works better for Africa. The ultimate litmus test will be done by the African people themselves. China wants to engage with them fully, but it's Africans' test eventually.